Good afternoon. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting today, wherever you are located. For me, I'm located on the land of the people of the Kulin Nation, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to their emerging leaders also. I would also like to extend a particularly warm welcome to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us this afternoon. My name is Pip Nicholson, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm the Dean of the Melbourne Law School, and I am absolutely delighted in our International Women's Day celebration to welcome to today's webinar students, alumni, staff and friends of the school, but the warmest and most particular welcome reserved for, of course, our guest this afternoon, the Honourable Jill Hennessy MP. The theme for this year's International Women's Day is Choose to Challenge. And as you all know, we are lucky enough to have with us this afternoon the Honourable Jill Hennessy MP. Let me say a few words by way of introduction. Jill is, as most of you I think do know, a member of the Victorian Legislative Assembly for the seat of Altona, and she has held that seat since 2010. From 2018 to 2020, Jill served as the Attorney-General for the State of Victoria and Minister for Workplace Safety, the second woman only to hold that position. During her tenure as Attorney-General, Jill oversaw the Royal Commission into Lawyer X, the Voluntary Assisted Dying Act, legislated nurse-to-patient ratios and introduced workplace manslaughter laws. And I might say that's a high-level summary of the work of the portfolio. It begins to scrape the surface of the work of that portfolio across her time in it. She has also served as the Minister for Health and Minister for Ambulance Services, and has held shadow ministerial roles for public transport, anti-corruption, corrections, crime prevention and women. Jill holds a Bachelor of Arts and Laws from the University of Monash and a Master of Laws from the Melbourne Law School. And Jill, it is a particular pleasure for me to welcome you to the conversation this afternoon.
Well, thank you very much, Pip, and a big warm welcome to all of those that are participating in today's forum. It's really delightful to be here, and if I too could also acknowledge traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging that might be participating today. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. And happy International Women's Day to you and to all of those that have been involved in organising today's forum.
Good, great. I want to kick off with a quite specific question. Women in the leadership, I think, is often in the spotlight, but no more so than over the last couple of years. Jacinda Ardern is often singled out for displaying and championing empathetic leadership. There's been extraordinary debate about the leadership of Angela Merkel in Germany, and with the election of Kamala Harris as Vice President of the United States, there are debates now in other countries also about women in roles of leadership. Do you see a day when women in leadership will not be the subject of comment?
Well, look, I kind of hope for that day, will come when it's not extraordinary for a woman to be in a leadership position, or in fact, in the case of Kamala Harris, women from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds to hold positions of leadership. It is always, I think, something that is remarked upon because it is remarkable. And whilst I don't want to take away the achievements of those women in getting to those positions, the fact that women are still so significantly underrepresented in positions of leadership, and when they are represented, there is often, a particular cohort, i.e. social policy areas that women tend to predominate in. And so I do hope that we will come to a day where it's not remarkable that a woman has been elected the leader, but I still think that we are a long way from that. It's worthwhile celebrating those achievements and the ascension of some of those women, but I think that we've still got a long way to go. And also I think that there is a related but separate conversation about the resilience of women in leadership positions, with Angela Merkel being, I think a very significant exception. But I think that one of the issues that we are going to have to contend with is where and how long women are able to stay in positions of leadership before sometimes we see what I would call quite sexist attacks on women in leadership positions, and all the reality of most women's lives, the impossibility to kind of manage the collision between work and life. And I think all of those issues are genuine and insignificant issues about women holding leadership positions. So I have great admiration for all of those women that you listed, but I still think we've got a long way to go. And I hope that it comes to the day where it's not remarkable and not remarked upon. And I say that because I think that we know the particular sexism that many women in leadership positions are still subjected to, whether that's in media commentary or just the attitudes that people bring towards their conception of what does a leader look like, what does a leader sound like, and what might their private life look like. All of those things, I still think we have a long way to go in order to nail down real progress.
And I mean, in talking to you last week, and for those of you who are joining us, Jill and I did have the chance to have a brief conversation last week, for which I'm very grateful. You talk also of the powerful gaze and the amplification of that gaze through social media, and the ways in which that can have a particularly corrosive impact on women. And women leaders in particular. I wonder if you'd talk a little about the experience of politicians and the ways in which they have been attacked through or made subject of comment through social media that in many ways escalates the burdens of office.
Absolutely. It used to be that it was only through traditional forms of media that people would comment on what women look like, and politics has increasingly become a visual exercise. And that was tough enough, I think, for women when we were only dealing with mainstream media platforms. And as social media platforms have proliferated, and in a way you could argue, as the Thomas Friedmans of the world did some time ago, flattening and democratizing access to politicians is a really good thing. But I also think that all of the negative things that have come with social media have meant that there is an additional burden that predominantly women, and also I would say, reflecting upon some of the experiences of my colleagues, people that are not Anglo, people who identify with who are LGBTIQ plus, all of those things means that those become subjects of political targeting sometimes around social media, and we don't really have the regulatory environment to respond to those. We haven't learned what the civil rules of engagement are. I think this is also something that, female journalists and other people that occupy public positions have to contend with. But I think that if we are going to try and encourage greater diversity into politics, and I think that's a good thing in all of its forms, what we are going to have to do is to really kind of make some kind of headway into what we kind of say, what's the level of vilification that people should have to endure? And if we are unable to ultimately deal with those kind of issues, and they're tricky legally and they're tricky culturally, but if we don't deal with those, then attracting the kind of people that we need to attract into public life is going to be made even more difficult, because people that are sensible and have good and ambitious lives are simply not going to be prepared to subject themselves to the sorts of things that women are subjected to. And that veers from the inappropriate and the sexist to, what are, in my view, criminal offences, threats of sexual assaults, all of those sorts of things. They're things that we've got to take seriously as a community. And, you know, it's my kind of really strong view that it shouldn't just be up to individual women to respond to those kind of things. We've got to find better regulatory or cultural responses in order to try and ensure that people are not forced to endure those kind of things that we would never expect anyone else to endure. And you know, there's been some kind of conversation about it. There's currently a parliamentary committee inquiry in Victoria into that is touching on this matter, but I don't think we really have mature responses. And I think for many people, but particularly women, the sorts of things that they get subjected to on digital platforms, it runs a real risk of serving as a disincentive to attracting people to participate in politics. And there's no perfect answers to trying to solve this, but we need people to be clever and purposeful about coming up with some solutions, be they regulatory or cultural, in the way in which we as a community choose to respond to that sort of behaviour.
Or indeed some combination of the two. I was arrested by hearing in earlier conversations the very particular threats that can be made to our female leaders, politicians and otherwise, including threats to family. And it does obviously become, it can be a catalyst to do something about it, but as you say, it can be a brake on the participation of women in public life, and that would be regrettable. Let's turn to your own leadership style. How do you describe yourself as a leader?
Well, you know, I suppose self-indulgently, because, you know, I suppose a better way for me to perhaps respond to it is the kind of leader that I aspire to be, and I hope that I'm making some headway on these characteristics. But purposeful leadership, I think, is a really critical part of my approach and what I aspire and hope to continue to contribute to in my life. And the reason I say that is the opportunity to change things and political capital. It's sometimes in short supply. So bringing purpose to your leadership and what it is that you want to achieve and being achievement focused, I think is really, really important. The second part, I think, is trying to bring as much compassion and authenticity and humanity to your leadership style as possible. And again, this can sometimes be a bit of a double-edged sword for women. I think that there is, you know, a really great case to be made for authenticity being, you know, people being prepared to admit when they're wrong, or they've made a mistake, or they've changed their mind, or to share a vulnerability. The double-edged sword for women, of course, is if you demonstrate vulnerability and emotion, those can sometimes serve to undermine or heighten the criticism that is made of women in terms of their suitability to hold leadership positions. But I think we live in a time where people's I don't know if this is appropriate language, Pip, but their crap meters, their ability to detect when someone is not being themselves or not telling the truth is so high now that I think there's a real hunger for people that are just themselves. Yeah. And I think people find that really refreshing, and that's what they find refreshing in some of the contemporary examples that you've highlighted or identified on the way through. But I also think it's a really impossible thing to ask of people to come and be a fake leader in whatever role they're putting themselves up for. Being able to bring your whole self to work, I think, is just as important for a person's effectiveness as it is for their well-being and their ability to genuinely connect with people and to bring compassion and authenticity to their role. So to bring purpose, to bring a focus on achievement, and to bring authenticity and compassion and a sense of humour, I think is another important survival tool that any woman stepping into the public domain needs to have in her toolkit bag.
Well, actually, interestingly enough, at the university earlier this week, we had a conversation between a group of women leaders, and the role of humour as glue in any organisation and also in public facing roles was called out in that conversation. So I'm interested to hear you mention it. One of the other risks, though, isn't there for female leaders, that they are stereotyped and expected to be empathetic leaders?
Absolutely.
And your response to that, Jill?
Well, I think that you can show empathy in lots of different ways, and I would again point to, for example, Angela Merkel, who I think is without question one of the most resilient and trusted politicians, certainly in contemporary European politics.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things, and there's a lot of political things that I disagree with Angela Merkel about, but one of the things that I admire about her is the fact that she is, smart and resilient and focused on what she does and what she delivers. And so I think that you can bring authenticity and compassion in ways in which you just demonstrate that you are committed to your job, or that you're really, really smart. There are so many brilliant people, I think, that are really evolving in our community to take up positions of leadership in a whole variety of fields. I think trying to say that you've got to be always either a type A personality or an extrovert, or if you're a woman that that you've got to demonstrate compassion and empathy all of the time as one of the assumptions, or the gendered assumptions about who you are. I think that will slowly change as people just crave for people to be themselves. And as the community and the polity are just overwhelmed with so much information and sources of information, so the person that kind of cuts through often is the person that is being themselves. And, we often say that, I often, when I'm going out and I'm talking to young people in schools, that you can always feel that you are, very, very lonely in the big crowds at schools and universities and workplaces. But what you can contribute and what you can achieve really can kind of change that sense of what a person's journey is. And so I kind of still live in great hope that bringing intelligence and achievement are still incredibly highly valued. But, we've got to make sure we as a community are also demanding those of our political leaders, and not saying that we want everyone to be, a movie star politician or a sporting star if we're going to, give them a role of influence in the public domain.
So let's talk about younger people, younger than you and I in any event, Jill. We've got lots of students in the audience, and welcome to you all. Many of the younger generation advocate for change and arguably lead in innovative ways, or at least challenge our long-standing preconceptions about leadership, not necessarily shared by the panel, but long-standing preconceptions about leadership. What advice do you have for the students of today in navigating their careers, developing their leadership potential, and perhaps picking up on the theme of International Women's Day, how they might choose to challenge to the benefit of change, for the benefit of reform?
I think, again, for every issue that I feel infuriated about there being a slow pace of change, the panacea or the salve on my frustration often is what I entrust will be generational change. And I feel I take great heart from what I see younger generations driving in terms of change and debates and innovation as well. But what I think is incredibly important if you're to be effective around political change, or you're seeking to influence public policy, is that you've got to move beyond just the sentiment. And one of the things that I've learned, and I've often learned this the hard way, that thinking through how you go about building a case for support, how you move beyond the frustration, what might be rational or a matter of justice to you is sometimes not enough. You've got to think about how you build a case for support for particular ideas and changes. You've then got to think about what is your strategy and your tactics to bring about that change. And one of the most difficult questions, I suppose, that I think that people in public life have to contemplate is what price are you prepared to pay for that change? And what price are you prepared to pay, for example, if you're a politician, for power? To what extent will you compromise your ideals if you can get some progress rather than no progress, but that involves a lot of compromise? Building the skills to be able to know what your own values and your own appetite is when you're dealing with those sorts of things, I think is incredibly important. And to not lose heart. Again, I often think of many of the legislative changes that I've been involved in, and some of those have been things that people thought and have said, this will never happen. You'll never be able to get support for, a particular proposition, and assisted dying reform in Victoria might be an example of that. And the trick is, I think, also to make sure that you work with people beyond the usual suspects, and in listening and seeking out the quiet pockets of support that exist. Not everyone is yelling into the big echo chamber of Twitter, for example. The great challenge is, where and how do you find people to organise support for a particular proposition? And I think thinking innovatively about how you build engagement, how you build support for a proposition, but also knowing your own values about what your own compromise appetite is also critically important.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about challenge as well, I think learning how to respectfully challenge. One of the dilemmas, I suppose, I've contemplated or reflected upon more in my both my professional and my personal lives as I've got older, is this, do I want to be right or do I want to be successful? And sometimes you can't be both. You can win the argument across the dinner table, but you've completely alienated everyone sitting around that dinner table. You might be able to win the argument in a cabinet, or you might be right and righteous about an issue, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you can persuade everybody else to come to your proposition. And thinking about, where are the spaces for progress? Where are the spaces of commonality? And how do we do that with a sense of urgency, particularly if you're fighting for change in an environment where there are grave injustices occurring? And that's sometimes, that's full of dilemmas for anyone that is committed to achieving change. But I suppose my reflection is, I've learned that being just right and righteous is not going to necessarily deliver the changes that you're seeking. And one of the things I've learned a lot about is how to build coalitions of support and engagement for ideas and for change. And I've also had to learn how to manage my own ego and resilience and disappointment when I've had to really think about compromise, or the fact that a person might hold a legitimate different point of view to you on an issue, and they're skills of life.
Yeah. So you've talked there very eloquently about the tension between being correct and being politically agile to advance a particular program of reform, and spoke particularly, I guess, about the voluntary assisted dying. But you also raised the importance of knowing yourself in that process. Now, how does a young student, or a student of any age, how does someone seeking to challenge come to know themselves in a way that equips them to better manage the negotiations that are going to be part of any reform process? What did you do?
I remember being managed by someone that I was very different to in our political outlooks and our personal values. and when this person would say to me, would you like feedback? Really, I didn't want the feedback. I only wanted good feedback. And so learning how you can accept disconfirming information, I think, is as critical a personal and psychological skill as it is a political skill, because when you go into politics, you'll get plenty of disconfirming feedback, let me tell you. But understanding what it is about yourself that tries to protect yourself from information or feedback that's disconfirming. So knowing someone that is really smart that you might disagree with or have a very different point of view, taking the risk around trusting people around feedback, I think, is really important. And just as important is developing the skill of being able to give feedback in a way that's constructive and useful. Learning from some of the hard knocks you get in life. And I learned so much from being a parent as well. And often when you see kids, it's always, who started this for? What's happened here? And it was like, well, it's her fault. No, it's her fault. She did this. Really trying to step through the avoidance of blame and attributing responsibility for an issue or a problem to everybody else but yourself, because often the only thing you can control is your own response and your own reflection. So learning from your own knockbacks in life, I think, is really, really important. Having good friends who build you up, and having a safe space where you can go and be vulnerable or talk about something where you made a mistake or a tactical error or something that you feel very, very frustrated by, I think, is also important. But also, I think, making sure that you constantly do attend to knowing yourself. And knowing yourself, I think, is one of the most important things to be not just successful in life, but happy in life. We bring, and particularly many women in politics, we bring a sense that we are imposters. We are occupying positions of public space where we don't look like everybody else, we don't feel like everybody else. And we all know what that feeling is like. And so sometimes it's about making sure that you note all of those issues, but work through what it is you're going to try to do to try and achieve change in any event, and being compassionate to other people that are also enduring those things. Being kind to yourself about failure. I saw someone share today, one of those memes online, and it said that people aren't afraid of failure, they're afraid of blame. And that resonated with me, particularly in politics. I think that that's a strong characteristic of how some of the public debates and discussions go. But taking the time, it is a worthwhile investment of your professional and personal time to reflect upon yourself, to invest in friendships with good people, and to make sure that your friendships and your professional circles include people who have different values and different outlooks to you, so you can continue to learn in a way that enables you to progress the sorts of things that you've worked so hard to try and achieve.
I really, there's a lot of conversation around mentorship, and obviously the Law School offers a mentor program, and so too do many workplaces now. It's almost routine. And in conversations along the way this week, it's also been pointed out, and it's just synergistic with what you've just said, Jill, that just as important as your mentor is your critic. And that you're learning as much from critic as from mentor. And I hear you loud and clear. Can I take you to one of the questions that's come through from our wonderful participants? What about the women who are from diverse backgrounds, as they have obviously further barriers than those who are privileged? Any comments on how they might be positioned and supported to have a voice?
Look, I think that all institutions and all leaders in institutions have got a really strong obligation for us to improve those opportunities really significantly. When I look around the Victorian Parliament, it is still a pretty white place. I'm really proud that I'm in a caucus of nearly 50% women, but diversity, cultural diversity, diversity around things like sexuality, disability, all of our institutions, we are so still significantly underdone. And one of the things that I find frustrating is it shouldn't have to be a person from a cold background, for example, or an Indigenous person that bears the sole responsibility to try and improve the opportunities. It's all of our responsibility to ensure that our institutions reflect the community that we serve. And I know it is a cliche, it is saying you can't be what you can't see. So it is important that we are profiling and highlighting people of diverse backgrounds that are in public positions. But I also think it is important that we are saying to our leaders, whether they're politicians or organisational leaders, what are you doing, or what is your organisation doing, or what is your expectation around building a culture that confronts the paucity of diversity in this organisation. This was something we confronted certainly when I was the health minister, and also when I was the Attorney General, in all sorts of environments, and actually holding people accountable to what it is that they're doing, and how they seek disconfirming information about why people from diverse backgrounds might find a culture hostile, or just how tough it is to make your way through university and to get job opportunities when you're not part of the networks that traditionally, have given some people a leg up or additional opportunities. So I think holding people accountable about those matters, and making sure that we don't burden diverse people in public positions as being it's just their responsibility. Infuriates me no end when I see friends from particularly diverse backgrounds as being the ones that have to bear the responsibility around making the case for reform. We get better decisions, better performance, companies are more profitable, parliaments make better decisions when they reflect the community that they serve. And we've got to continue to make sure that we're asking people and putting in place some measures or forms of accountability around how we're ensuring that everyone has a genuine equality of opportunity, and that leaders have a responsibility to ensure that their organisations reflect those communities and are attendant to the barriers, sometimes visible, sometimes invisible, that can make it feel impossible for certain people to try and progress their career opportunities.
And so on a question of accountability, I take another question from the audience. Jennifer Petruni asks, the federal coalition government has not appointed a female judge to the Victorian Registry of the Federal Court since 2013. It has appointed 9 male judges in that intervening period. What message do you think that sends to younger female lawyers?
Well, it sends the message of there's no place for people like you around here. That's the message it sends. And my experience of judicial appointment and recruitment is often, and I say this from when I was the Attorney General to other positions that I've held, where people would come back with a short list that had, 4 what I would call usual suspect candidates on it, and no one diverse. Is you've got to have decision makers that are prepared to push lists back and say, look again. Yep. And it is about that people are out there. There are so many brilliant and experienced people out there. And I discovered this a lot in the health sector as well. So many people who are not necessarily at a networking event at drinks after work because they're goddamn running to get to childcare before 6 o'clock to pick up kids to go home and do another shift at home. You know, where and how we find people for appointments, I think, is a genuinely, you know, it's a genuine matter of public interest. And, you know, I've never shied away. I'm in a political party that has quotas. I think that there's no argument to say that if left to their own devices, we will not get the sorts of diversity that we need quick enough. I completely reject the argument that is sometimes put up about merit. There are women of merit, but what we need is people that are prepared to go and look for them, and look for them in places that may not have been used as a recruitment pool before. And I think it sends a terrible and disheartening message when professional opportunities for women are not kind of publicly evidenced. And, you know, the problem is, what is the consequence for people of only appointing blokes? It's not necessarily going to turn the outcome of an election, but it is a genuine public interest issue, because these are, of course, bodies that make incredibly serious and important decisions and determinations. And if the community, and 51% of the community isn't represented in those, how are they legitimate decisions?
Yep.
Trying to propel that debate beyond just those that are following it or are already converts to the case for diversity, that's where our quest and our work is.
So you've talked, if I can take you to your work for a minute, Jill, you've talked in particular about the challenges that are confronted when you propose controversial reforms in the context of the voluntary assisted dying legislation that was passed in 2017. You've also talked of the responsibilities in office of appointment of others to office. What do you think most challenged you when you were Minister for Health and Attorney General? And then after that, I'm going to take you to the particular role you had last year in response to the pandemic. But before we get to that, I'd like you to reflect on your role as both Minister for Health and Attorney General, and what were some of the real challenges for you in those roles?
Look, time and resources, really, are probably the two best ways to summarise it. One of the issues is when you're a cabinet minister, part of the challenge or responsibility is you're not just there trying to get things supported in a cabinet and then through a parliament. You have a huge bureaucracy and administration, and I've got to say that the Victorian Public Service, I think, is you know, second to none. I think that there are so many brilliant people, and I want to put a pitch into for people thinking about what their life jobs might be, to think about the public sector and the public service. But the implementation is also incredibly important. But when you're a politician, you don't know how long you're going to be a politician for. In Victoria, we have 4-year contracts, we have 4-year electoral cycles, but you don't know how long you're going to be a minister for. You don't know how long you're going to have the political capital to do something. And so the things that really challenge you are, you know, you've got a list a mile long, both election commitments and things that, should the political opportunity arise, you know, that you're personally interested in progressing. But how do you then set what the priorities should be? Because you can't do everything. And that's what I found probably really, really challenging. So time, resources, and again, that comes down to priorities. When you're a cabinet minister, you're often debating with other you know, very important demands on limited resources. So that was always an issue. I think, you know, one of the other issues, or one of the other things that is not that I've necessarily found challenging, but you know, I think is something that you've got to build into your resilience, is it's just simple things of being in the supermarket. And, you know, when I was the health minister, someone would want to, you know, roll their pants up to show me a shoddy job that a nurse had done, or would want to stop me to tell me what a fabulous job you know, a nurse had done at the local hospital. And so this the personal cost, I suppose, is something that you've got to think about, how you build some place and space, both for digital detox, your relationships, your family, and your own well-being as well. Because it's 24 hours a day, you're accountable 24 hours a day. And, you know, you have this wonderful opportunity, and you don't want to necessarily, you know, lose the opportunity to do things, but you've got to make some hard calls about what are your priorities, what are you prepared to give up for those priorities, and how do you keep yourself being a human being, I think, is just another really important part.
So if we go back to that notion that, and you've called it out loud and clear, that, you know, there's personal well-being, there's familial well-being, there's relationship well-being, but in office there's those two critical issues of time and resources.
Yes.
Now let's add that pandemic to the mix. And I did, dear listeners, really stop and think about whether or not we wanted to go to the pandemic when so much conversation focuses on it. But Jill, you did have the unique experience of sitting on the government's pandemic response leadership group, not quite the right name for it, but that was the function that you held. Now that must have caused real rub on the other work that you were trying to achieve in the portfolio that you held at the time. Yeah. Can you talk us through the sort of impost of a COVID-19 and the necessary response for it on the government of the state last year?
Yeah, well, I mean, the world gets turned upside down, as it did for all people impacted by the pandemic globally, but everything becomes about the pandemic and the prevention and the pandemic response. And your colleagues are all assiduously working on those issues, but you still have to run other services. You still have to think about how the justice system, for example, is going to be managed when there's no jury trials because of the impact of chief health officer directions. You've still got to have the planning in place around what happens if you got an outbreak in the corrections system. You've still got to manage the fact that there are people going to work being injured and killed in workplaces every day. So learning how you do that in a way, it was really like an emergency department where you've just got to triage things constantly. And in a way where politics is always about the battle between time and resources often, it was an intensification, I suppose, of those that triaging that you've always got to do, where the stakes were extraordinarily high and there's no, you know, roadmap about what to do. And again, to see how people worked, how hard they worked, the personal responsibility from everyone who worked in the freight and logistics to the health sector is pretty extraordinary. And so one of the many lessons that I've learnt from my exposure to that period of time was people are pretty extraordinary and do rise to the challenges in impossible circumstances often. But it's also pretty tough for people to do that when they don't know when this will end. Yeah. And for many of the challenges that you have, again, you know, it's like, are we there yet? Like kids in a car, or if you're working in political electoral cycles, it's, you know, 1 year into an election, we've got to get this done. We've got so many weeks of Parliament left. We've got 18 pieces of legislation. We're going to try and, you know, see if we can get supported. You've got an end, there is an end in the bracket or an end in the parenthesis. And with COVID, there was, you know, going forward with not necessarily the end in sight. And so that, I think, made it very, very challenging for people. But I, you know, and there'll be plenty of time for COVID reflections. But one of the many reflections that I have is that people are extraordinary, and ordinary people do extraordinary things all the time. Sometimes we just haven't bothered to look, or it hasn't been given the attention it deserves. And I also think that Corona has made the most uncontestable case about inequality around who works where and why. In this country, we know we're incredibly privileged, but we still have some pretty entrenched structural inequality. COVID, I think, has certainly put a very strong shining light on that. And I think that that's got to be one of our public policy priorities as we come out of this pandemic, and think about how do we make a country and a community and a society more resilient to those sorts of challenges in the future. So, you know, lots to learn, pretty exhausting, and, you know, the stakes were pretty high, but there was just so much inspiration, I think, in the response from extraordinary people, from everyone who was still putting stuff on our supermarket shelves, to people that were triaging in emergency departments.
Yeah, and look, if I can just call out what I saw in the school too. I was as inspired by our students as our staff, and I was blown away by both. And just that idea that, look, we're stepping through uncertain times, but we can just work through that in a steadfast way, was at times the thing that really held this institution together. I want to change tack now, Jill, and we're still getting questions coming in through from the audience, which is fabulous. But when we last spoke to you in 2019, I think you gave an interview for MLS News from memory. You said that you were keen to advance or reform sexual harassment laws. And given the allegations made by Brittany Higgins of sexual assault and rape in the Federal Parliament recently, and then subsequent unfolding of similar allegations from a range of women, what do you see as the role of governments, state or federal, in shifting the culture, if we accept how it's been characterised, of sexual harassment in the Parliament?
First and foremost, you know, gender inequality and, you know, reducing, you know, and aiming to eliminate gender inequality, I think is just a very important, and I know that's a big, lofty, chunky public policy ideal, but again, in solving many of the horrific experiences of women and children, gender inequality is such a fundamental driver, and until and unless we shift that tectonic plate, the rest of the stuff we're doing, you know, it's really difficult to get to the fundamentals. Having said that, I think that there's regulatory and cultural progress and priorities that need to continue to be advanced from a regulatory perspective. You know, I think, and we've seen, I think, some recent announcements about these issues, looking at sexual harassment from a occupational health and safety perspective, I think is really critical. Mandatory reporting around claims of sexual harassment is something that I understand is, you know, genuinely going to be examined. And how do we move away from like a complaints-based system where all of the onus and the responsibility is on the subject, you know, the person who has been the victim of the harassment, to go and change and to self-help. Now, doing that at the best of times is nigh impossible, and we know that from all of the important work that Kate Jenkins nationally has done to work that's being done here in Victoria. So I think moving away from individual responsibility to you know, regulatory responsibility is really important, is one of the really important changes around sexual harassment.
And indeed, there was a very interesting panel on this topic last year that I was privileged enough to run, where the Victorian Legal Services Board,
Yes.
Josh Bernstein and Jennifer Petruni came together. And if you aggregate the comments that those three experts offered, it was around looking at different ways in which institutions were responsible for the safety of the workplace.
Absolutely.
When you reflect, let's go back to the Parliament though, as workplace. You know, Malcolm Turnbull says the federal Parliament at least is like the private sector in the 70s, I think, if I'm not misquoting him. Do you think there's a sense in which the Victorian Parliament is an outlier in terms of a workplace offering cultural safety, or do you think it has moved away along towards offering a safe workplace for women?
I think you've always got to be really cautious of again, this is about being prepared to confront disconfirming evidence. I think anyone that ever says, oh no, we're an outlier, when all of the evidence points, you know, the other way nationally, I'm cautious about that proposition. I do think that there still remains significant work to be done in political culture around sexual harassment. One of the issues is, of course, the enforceability just from the perspective of occupational health and safety standards of, for example, MP to MP harassment or allegations. The enforceability, given that you have, you know, other different parliamentary processes, I think that that's a significant issue, and I think that's something that ought to be examined. And I know that there's currently some work going on at the Victorian Parliament to that end. But to make sure that no one is above the law, we've heard a lot about the rule of law in recent times, but to make sure no one is above the law. And then I think the second issue is, what is it about political culture that makes us different? Now, the first is, I think, and Julie Bishop, I think, made this argument well on a recent appearance on the 7:30 report, where she talked about when you work in political employment, you're working for a team. The sense that you would go and rock the boat or do something that might cause political embarrassment, that is, you know, perhaps going to be seen as not, you know, being disloyal to the team. So, and then on top of that, put an entrenched power imbalance between, you know, a member of parliament or a minister and a staff member, that makes a pretty heady recipe, I think, for when and if harassment occurs, for it to be secret, covered up, and you know, no genuine evidence about you know, what a pathway to try and resolve and to try and genuinely get those sorts of behaviours to stop. So I think the political culture is also a significant issue. Having more women, I think, is part of the solution to that, but also having genuine and real consequences for those that do sexually harass people in the workplace. And I'm not quite sure that we've seen any evidence of that occurring in recent times. And in fact, I think the fury and the rage that many of us feel probably point to the fact that, you know, there hasn't been a lot of accountability or evidence in that environment. And so
I'm going to have to draw you to a close on that question. There's an enormous question that I haven't yet reached, but which we might keep for the next time I talk to you, Jill Hennessy, and that is, are we overgoverned? Because across the interview, we've talked about the need for law reform, and inevitably that brings with it new regulatory instruments. And so one of our questioners are we overgoverned? If you can answer that with yes or no, I'll let you off on that, or we can reserve that for another time. It's probably just a good point for reflection.
I think I know you will say, I mean, politicians, asking a politician for a yes or no answer, you set yourself up for failure, Pip.
Yeah, I can own that.
I think we are, but I also think that we need more effective regulation. We could have less regulation, but let's have that regulation we do have being more effective, is essentially my view.
Very good. Wasn't yes or no, but it was very succinct. So thank you, Jill. I guess many in the audience would know that you've chosen to renounce your position on cabinet. What is next for Jill Hennessy? And what is it that you want to do most just in the next couple of years, Jill Hennessy? And as we come to a close.
Yeah, look, I'm obviously very passionate about Melbourne's western suburbs, and so I want to continue to represent the West. I'm very interested in the post-COVID economic recovery, particularly for women and particularly for those groups of people that we know were, who are in such economically vulnerable circumstances that the systems have kind of genuinely failed them. I'm very interested in continuing to support my colleagues being effective. We've got a lot of young people and a lot of young women in the Parliament, so I'm very interested in assisting them. And I've been working on some projects with some organisations around, how do you build high-performing organisations? How do you genuinely influence the work of government? And there's a range of policy issues that I'm still very passionate about, that I'm going to continue to be a strong advocate for in my political party, in the government and in the Parliament.
Thank you so much. Can I, on behalf of everyone that's joined us this afternoon, give you a vote of thanks, Jill Hennessy?
Sure.
It's been wonderful to sit with you. Your candour, your preparedness to talk openly across a very broad suite of questions is deeply appreciated, and as was your clarion call to purposeful and authentic leadership. For this International Women's Day, thank you very, very much for your time.
Okay.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Cheers.